Okay, thank you everybody for attending the talk today. I'm really happy to have Halina present her current work on shared sovereignty as a governance framework for the resolution of maritime boundary disputes. It's work that she's done from our database, so it's really interesting to see how we can use the data in the database to, in a way, question the database. And it was her idea, which I have supported, but I'm so very much looking forward to the paper. And before we start, what I'll just do very quickly is do the territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge and respect the Langkwangdan, Songhees and Esquimalt people, on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and Langkwangdan and Leksanek people, whose historical relationship to the land continues to this day. And I also want to add that I have lived on this beautiful land for more than 20 years. And I always am so happy to live here, even in these very troubled times. I think we actually are here very privileged. And so the acknowledgement obviously is sincere, but also I think should carry lots of weight and inspiration to our research. And then with that, maybe I'll introduce Halina very, very briefly. Halina is a postdoctoral fellow in Big Lab. She has worked on and off with Big Lab from the time that we started developing the database, so about 4 years, maybe 5. And she has a PhD. She's worked with at the University of British Columbia or Canadian campus, and is a specialist of international relations. And with Big Lab, I think she's worked on at least 3 papers, maybe 4, and has a couple of papers that are either published or in publication. And so this one would be the 4th paper that she is doing out of our database. So it's quite interesting to see how it's coming together. And with that, thank you so much, Halina, for preparing and for accepting to do this. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I would like to before I start, I would like to say that I'm joining from beautiful Kelowna, which is the traditional and unceded territory of Syilx Okanagan people. And as Manuel has just mentioned, that I've been working with the Big Lab on several projects using the big database. And this specific research project, Shared Sovereignty as a Governance Framework for the Resolution of Maritime Boundary Disputes, it's part of a larger project. The project that Emmanuel and I started working on some time ago. And this research project focuses on the resolution of boundary disputes. And we started with looking at the resolution of land boundary disputes, and then switched to maritime boundary disputes, and looked at third-party resolution mechanisms, right? When we looked at arbitration and adjudication. And the inspiration for this specific project was actually a call for papers that Emmanuel shared with me some time ago. Actually, it was a call for papers shared by some participants at the Association for Borderlands Studies, actually the conference in Seattle that many of you will be attending. And what was interesting about it is that we decided to look at this mechanism, this shared sovereignty or joint sovereignty mechanism, as an alternative to boundary dispute resolutions. So it's still very much research in progress. Like some other research that we've been doing with Emmanuel is kind of more developed, but I decided to choose this specific topic because I would like to present it to you and actually share some thoughts and actually the way of thinking about this project, and maybe you could provide some feedback and some advice, right, in terms of moving forward. So with this project. So one second, let me just. I hope you can hear me and you can see my slides.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. Okay. One second. I'm just trying to
Yeah, we see it very well.
organize my view here. Okay. One second. Okay. So so I'll start with, of course, with our research questions, right? So we have three, I would say three sort of questions, sub-questions. So we would like to examine, first of all, when and why states create zones of shared sovereignty to settle their maritime boundary disputes. How effective is this mechanism? And what helps explain its successes or failures, right? Or like success failure, I know it's kind of framed like a negative, positive, whatever, but of course there is middle ground. But basically, our dependent variable, as I always like to start with, our dependent variable, right, is of course dispute resolution. It's still our main interest. It's still something that we're looking at. So here, more specifically, we're looking at the maritime boundary dispute resolutions, right? And this shared sovereignty framework is this mechanism that's supposed to help resolve those disputes, right? Among many other things, but that's there is literature out there that suggests that shared sovereignty could be the answer to entrenched disputes. And sometimes the disputes cannot even be resolved after the intervention of adjudication or arbitration, and negotiations often fail. So, so when we have those unresolved disputes, maybe we should go with this framework, right? Shared sovereignty framework. Okay, so that's interesting. So why not, right? Let's examine this relationship, right, between dispute resolution and shared sovereignty framework. So why is this important? Well, I know that in the current situation, right, like talking about peaceful resolution of border disputes, international law, and even the current system of international relations, and by the current, I mean the post-Second World War system, right? It's kind of maybe some people think that's a little bit out of touch, right, with what's happening, but this is something that we could discuss later on. But this topic is important, right? Because there is literature out there, quantitative literature, that talks about the potential of territorial disputes to escalate to war, right? And territorial disputes are more likely than other types of disputes to escalate to an armed conflict, right? So needless to say that we live in a somewhat dangerous world that's becoming more and more dangerous, right, as our international system becomes unsettled. And of course, these disputes that maybe have been dormant for some time, or kind of some other countries could be pushy in terms of revisioning the borders that have been settled, right? We are talking about this kind of potential escalation. But for our purposes, right, what is interesting is that many contemporary disputes are centered around access to resources, right, and more specifically maritime resources. And another interesting kind of information that almost 40% of maritime boundaries have not been settled. which obviously creates this high potential for confrontation and escalation to an armed conflict, right? So it's interesting, right, because we're talking about the contemporary system of international relations, and there is such a huge focus on sovereignty, right, and the exclusive control over the territory by nation states, right, and our globe is divided into nation states. But at the same time, we always talk about borders, but interestingly enough, many of those borders are still disputed, right? Even though they might, in most cases, right, we don't have an open and intensive conflict, right? It could be just unsettled and. But as we know, right, when there is this uncertainty and vagueness, anything can happen at any point of time. So that's the rationale, right? Why we're interested in examining that. So these are practical considerations. And another important consideration is some theoretical contribution that we hope to accomplish, right? Because when we're looking at the literature, and there are many studies that are quantitative, right? That they just run some regression analysis and provide some important, of course, information related to conflict, right? Like, for example, the finding about territorial disputes that are more likely to escalate to an armed conflict, right? But at the same time, we have lots of case studies. And when I started looking at this specific framework of shared sovereignty, there is a strand of literature that talks about this arrangement, like in a kind of in a not in an idealistic way, but kind of the intention there is to propose something constructive and put forward some models that could work, right, for the resolution. So there is very practical goal there. And there are some case studies, obviously, that look at different conflicts. But what we are trying to do here is to use our database for case selection, as we always do, right? And our database, Borders and Globalization database, have a specific, a special feature indicator, right? It's I don't know, it's probably all of you know, right, that our big DIETS database includes several data sets, right? And one of those data sets is called Foundations of DIETS data sets. So we're looking at maritime borders, and there is also an indicator that actually identifies those DIETS that have a zone of shared sovereignty, right? So that's kind of how we were able to select, right, those DIETS useful for this specific study. And I just put it there at the bottom of the slide, right, that there are 13 DIETS with a joint regime and 3 DIETS that form a tridominium. So that's what our data set includes, right? So obviously there are other variables that could be useful for the study, like border disputes, and generally speaking, the conflicts data set has some other variables as well. And history of DIETS data set could also be interesting when looking at the dates when the boundary was established or adjusted, and so on and so forth, right? But one of the limitations, of course, is that there is not much room for descriptive detail in our database. So it's like a starting point, and then it's still the groundwork, right? Going and searching for more information, right? To get a better idea, right, of what's happening, right, like looking at those case studies. And another limitation that I also noticed, right, while reading the literature on this topic, is that I came across some other arrangements, right, that would classify as sovereign shared sovereignty arrangement or joint regimes. So there are different kind of ways, different definitions. But what I noticed that some of them are not included in our database. So it's something interesting that I hope to explore later on, right? So basically, as I just said, I identified those diets from our database and extracted some information, useful information from several data sets, such as foundations, also look at history, conflict data set, right? Kind of my assumption is that because our data set is always kind of trying to show the most current data, right? So my assumption is that some joint regimes that probably existed in the past, but stopped operating, right, at the time when our data was collected, right? They are not in our database. So it's kind of one of my assumptions, and I may have to look at that, right? Because those cases that don't exist anymore could also provide important insights, right? But for now, just starting working on this topic, I'm looking at the data set, at those diets that are included in our data set for the purposes of our research project at this particular juncture, right? Okay, so that's basically a little bit about the methodology, right? As I said, we have our research question or research questions, right? Basically, we're examining the relationship between the shared sovereignty framework or mechanism and maritime boundary dispute resolution, right? So I looked at the data set, I identified those cases, right? And the goal here is, of course, to answer our research questions, like those three sub-questions, right? That, of course, are interrelated. And ideally, I hope we could come up with some sort of classification, right? Because when I'm reading the literature, I can see that there is a discussion of some aspects of shared sovereignty and how it could be used for dispute resolution, but then those articles would miss other aspects, right? So my goal is to look at all possible factors, look at our cases, and try to come up with some patterns, right? Just to discuss this topic, yes, in a more pattern-like way, I would say, right? So it's not like all our cases that are somehow go separately, right, with no common or very, very common thread, right? That's kind of the goal here. So, so what to do, right? So I look at the literature, right, from two angles. First, of course, is dispute resolution, right? I looked at boundary dispute resolution literature with a specific angle, of course, on maritime boundary dispute resolution, if possible, right? If there was any specific literature, and then after that, I looked at the literature that explores this shared sovereignty framework, right? And that's the goal here when looking at the literature, is to come up with those themes or factors, as I said, or variables, if you want to call them this way, for our analysis, right? For the analysis of our cases. So looking at the boundary dispute resolution literature. So first and foremost, of course, we're looking at the causes, potential causes of boundary disputes, and there are, of course, there could be many, such as economic value of the disputed territory, strategic or military value, and of course, there is lots of literature that is pointing at symbolic or emotional significance or religious significance of some territories, right? So, and this literature, of course, discusses both land and maritime disputes, right? But what is important, especially for our purposes, right, is when we look at the relationship between the value of the disputed territory and successful dispute resolution, right? So there is quantitative research out there that says that when the territory has economic value, settlement is much more likely, right? The baseline here assumes that when the territory has no particular economic value, right? So it's intuitive. We probably can understand why this is happening, right? Because if there is some economic value, both parties to the dispute would be interested in reaching a certain settlement so they can use the territory or part of that territory to their advantage, right? Because when there is a dispute, you can't really do much there, whether it's terrestrial or whether we're talking about land or maritime area. However, when this territory has strategic, cultural, or religious value, settlement is less likely, even when there is no particular economic value. But we're talking about those emotional factors. It might be, it looks like it's harder for the parties to give up, right? The territory could have something to do with national pride and so on and so forth. So, as I mentioned before, so contemporary disputes are mainly about access to resources, right, or maritime resources more specifically. And we can understand why actually talking about the value of the disputed territory, right, and focusing on the economics of it is relevant in our case. So, just generally, when we look at some trends, right, that are discussed in the literature on maritime boundaries, right, is that there is a growing economic interest in the maritime domain, and there are many reasons for that, including some technological advances, right? That there are more opportunities actually to do some exploration and then with any like exploitation of maritime resources, right? So something that was considered of no particular economic value now may become more promising, right, in terms of generating some revenue, right, from that territory. And related to that, of course, is the growing relevance of the maritime domain in domestic politics. But it's not necessarily, right, related to the economic value, but it's part of it there as well. Here we have kind of, on the one hand, right, that as we just mentioned, that of course there is this a huge intense incentive to settle the boundary, right, when we know that there is some economic value, and especially when natural resources can be exploited, and the parties would need legal certainty, right, for resource development. It would be nearly impossible to attract investors or even start something when there is a dispute, right? So there is this incentive to settle the boundary, but at the same time, because of this high economic value, there might be less incentive to give up the territory, because then if you know that a specific territory is rich in, say, oil and gas, right, then why would you give up this opportunity? So, because especially if you think you have a valid claim. So this could result, of course, in a situation, right, when the dispute remains unsolved, and nobody wants, neither party wants to give up the territory, and eventually, right, it could even escalate to a conflict, an armed conflict, right, the worst of all. So that's kind of where this arrangement, right, this shared sovereignty arrangement could be very handy, right? Because especially when the tensions are high, and as I said, there could be the symbolic relevance involved, right, and national pride, and that you just no one wants to give up this territory, and so the answer could be, okay, if we think that both parties have more or less like maybe relevant claims, right? Or it's not certain who would get what eventually, right? Maybe sharing resources is a good answer, right? So at least there is this literature, right, that's just talking about this arrangement as a potential answer. However, as I said, right, we are focusing on boundary dispute resolution, right? So, okay, so we have the shared development as an alternative, right? But what about the limitation? So I'm going to give up on that. So there are different actually ways to look at it, right? Some literature is pointing at joint development or this using the shared sovereignty framework, right, as an alternative to delimitation. So when it's impossible to do delimitation, right, it's time consuming, expensive. If you go to, for example, the ICJ, it could take time, and you need to assemble all this evidence, hire experts, and all of that, right? And it may not result in anything, right? There might be even a decision by the ICJ, but it doesn't mean that this decision will be accepted and implemented, right? As we know, the system of international law is not the same as our domestic system, and there is an issue, of course, with enforcement, right? It relies on both parties honoring that decision. And another thing, of course, is yes, we have this overlapping claims, and we could have this deadlock. So why wouldn't we just abandon attempts to delimit the boundary and start sharing those resources? So at least it's a sort of win-win, right? Because if there is a conflict and we're not developing this area, so no one gets a dime, right? But if we could share, at least we're getting something. And the idea here is, of course, that this development, shared development, is often perceived as a interim solution, right? So maybe where at some point maybe we'll be able to agree on the line, right? So that's kind of the body of literature. However, joint development zones could also be created in addition to delimitation, right? So that's kind of one of the interesting things. So for our purposes, right, for the purposes of our case studies that we have 14, right, we have 13 joint regimes and 1 tridominium. So looking at this literature, okay, so I put I wrote down those exactly those specific variables, right? We'll look at this relationship between delimitation and joint development, and kind of when analyzing our cases, we will look at whether the joint development zone, right, in that specific case, was in addition to delimitation or in the absence of delimitation, right? So that's what point of interest for us, for our study, based on the literature. And okay, I'm just looking here. Okay, it's a little bit there. Okay, let me just this slide. I'm just not sure how much time I have. Oh, yes, I still have time. Okay, so another one, and I think I already mentioned that, another important factor is, of course, whether it's interim arrangement, right, or it's more of an open-ended or permanent arrangement, right, when we talk about those factors that may impact the success of those joint development zones, right? So just going back here, looking at the sovereignty, shared sovereignty, right, as a governance framework, as I said, they could be called differently. Like, for example, Samuels, there was this big, long article, like 50 pages by Samuels, who published this article in 2008, and looking at the framework, and basically it's calling it a condominium, and this encompasses both land and maritime shared sovereignty arrangements, right? So that article is kind of looking like surveying all those possible arrangements, looking at history and some contemporary arrangements, but basically the definition of it, right, that the arrangement is when we have two or more states that exercise joint sovereignty over a territory, right? So that's what we're talking about. I probably should have started with that when I mentioned shared sovereignty framework. What it is, I kind of assume that we all intuitively know what it all about, right? But the idea here, right, of course, as we know, we like to think of the world, right, as divided into those sovereign states, and each state has its exclusive sovereignty over territory. But this arrangement is a bit different, right, because we could have two states or three states, and when we talk about the tridominium, that share their sovereignty over a specific territory, right? And indeed, right, this arrangement could be temporary in nature, but nothing prevents actually this arrangement to be a long-lasting solution, right? And so that's another factor, right? Another variable that I added to our table. As I said, what I'm talking, right? As I said, it's a research in progress, right? So I'm just telling you kind of my way of thinking about this project, right? And thinking when reading the literature, examining the literature, and adding some relevant stuff into our table. So I'm looking at those arrangements and thinking, okay, let's see whether it's provisional or more open-ended, right? And whether it has any impact on the success of this arrangement in terms of dispute resolution, right? Okay, 1 second. I'll try to do something, and now my slide. Okay. One thing I'd like to mention here, right, is that for this specific project, we're only looking at maritime boundaries, right? And it's interesting because this article that I mentioned before actually focuses more on land arrangements, right? But what was interesting is that the author actually points out that it might be easier to create shared sovereignty arrangements, right, for maritime boundary disputes. Because yes, indeed, we have this access to natural resources, but it's easier to manage those territories jointly because people are not involved there, right? So we don't have to worry about citizenship, the issue of citizenship and different rights of rights of those people with regard to two potential countries, right? Parties, if they jointly govern a specific territory populated by people, right? But when it comes to resources, so kind of the idea here is it's actually more manageable, it's more doable. So it might be actually an easier way, right? To go about resolving those disputes, right? So that's actually interesting and something relevant to our discussion here. Another point when it comes to this arrangements, right? As I said, whether they're provisional or open-ended. So actually the convention, United Nations Convention, right, on the law of the sea actually has those provisions, right? That when states have competing claims, they could enter into provisional arrangements of a practical nature. So it's even encouraged, right? States are even encouraged to create some provisional arrangements, right? So we have this legal basis even for joint zones, right? So another factor, another variable I added to our table is the method. So here it's dispute settlement, but we're not talking that even there is dispute settlement here, right? When it comes to creating those arrangements, right, they could be arrangement by an agreement between two parties or more parties to the dispute, or this may be the result of a conciliation procedure, or even something suggested or encouraged by an arbitral tribunal or even the court, right? So there are different ways to do that. So that's something that could also be taken into consideration as a potential variable. For example, could we hypothesize that those arrangements that were encouraged by third parties could be more long-lasting or less long-lasting, right? So it's something also interesting to look at, right? So basically, I just have this. As I said, it's still a research in progress. Very much it's still research in progress, and I would like to eventually, right? The goal here is to populate this entire table, right? So we have 14 joint arrangements here, right? And these are diets, right? So the first three is the Gulf of Fonseca Tridaminium, right? But then we have those joint regimes, right, between two parties. And so I have this table that I populate little by little. There's still lots of work to do, but I just wanted to show you here that exactly that's kind of how I look at it, right? So these are our cases. So we have mechanisms, basically, whether it was the result of negotiation, conciliation, and so on and so forth. Then whether this boundary is settled, whether it's delimited or not, right? Then whether it's interim or open-ended. And then I'm looking at economic value. Okay, here, why is it important? We kind of assume, obviously, that when those joint zones are created, most likely they would have some economic value, right? At least in terms of even like potential, for example, potential for finding some resources, right? So maybe like for exploration, the joint zone could be created for exploration. But what is important, I think, here is just to look more specifically whether it's only exploration or also exploitation, and how it's divided and how the setup, right, when it comes to economic resources, how this setup may impact, right, the success or failure or lackluster, right, performance of this mechanism. And then there are other factors. I kind of group them here in one column just because it's a slide, right? But in Excel file, obviously you can have lots of columns, right, that are more specific, right? For example, whether the specific area has a strategic or military value, right? Then whether it has a symbolic value. What about some environmental concerns, right? So these are potential factors. Then some other factors could include ideology. For example, there is literature that is talking about some cases that, this ideological affinity or friendship between two countries, right, that are parties to the dispute, and then they decided to create a joint arrangement, right? That kind of ideological proximity or like a friendly relationship could actually help this shared sovereignty regime succeed, right? So these are all different factors, and obviously, when I look at different cases, right, or look at different articles that discuss several cases in one article, right? Sometimes it's like just one case, and then there is one or two more for comparison's sake, right? So this is also like helpful to figure out those potential variables and add to our table, right? So the contribution of this project, right, that Emmanuel and I hope to actually move forward, right, and could be one article or even couple, depending how we go about it. And if you have any suggestions, that would be most welcome. But I think where the contribution could be, right, it's a lot of work because we have quite a lot of cases. And as I said, there are some cases that are not in our database and could potentially be useful, right, if they cease their operation. So that's also, it's very important, right, to know kind of what happened and what led to the end of those arrangements, right? But what is interesting, right, that what we want to do here is that we want in kind of one project, we want to examine not just one or two. For example, there is an article that looks at conciliation, right, most as a way to create shared sovereignty arrangements. So, but we are interested in actually looking at the broad range of factors, right, and figure out if exactly what patterns exist and how we could classify, right, these different arrangements, right, in kind of to better understand how this sovereignty, shared sovereignty framework works in practice and how it could be hopefully applied in the future, right, to other disputes, right? If we go with this idea that it's indeed a helpful arrangement, right? So just I know okay, I still have a bit of time, so just very briefly. Just to give you a couple of examples, I was creating several slides, and I must say that moving here, it's kind of was a bit hard, so I lost some information. So if you see some inconsistencies, I was trying to recreate from my file into PowerPoint this morning because there was some mix-up. So just if you see some omissions or some kind of weird information, just let me know. So a couple of interesting cases here that I really would like to share with you because I think that could be just something that would illustrate our discussion, right? So as I said, for each case, we would like ideally to have something like that, right? And what is interesting, right? The first case I would like to talk about a little bit is this Japan-South Korea agreement. And why is it interesting? Because for a couple of things actually, right? First and foremost, it's geopolitics of it, right? Emmanuel and I are working on another paper for a special issue that looks at maritime dispute in the ASEAN region, right? And of course, we all know about China's assertive position, right, in that area. And what is interesting is that here it's kind of there is that involvement of China as well, right? You wouldn't think that way, but it's also interesting here as well. So we have these two countries, Japan, South Korea, and what happened is that there was a UN commission several decades ago, right? That there was a report by the UN commission that said that that specific area in the East China Sea, right, had huge oil and gas reserves that were comparable to the Persian Gulf, right? So of course, that was motivation enough, right, for Japan and South Korea to enter into some sort of an agreement, right, to pursue economic exploration and hopefully exploitation, right? And what is interesting about this case is that when we look at the column, economic value, the economic value column, right? That here we're talking about exploration, right? And it's interesting how it played out, right? That in a way, there was that agreement, but not much in terms of economic value came out of that. At least based on that literature that I've surveyed so far, right? One of the challenges with actually looking at all of these cases, right? There are so many moving pieces and some updates all the time, so it's often it's easy to get lost in all of that information. But But basically, what is interesting, right, is that so we have this factor, right, that there was supposed to be exploration that was stalled, right, because Japan raised actually an issue with economic viability of all of that arrangement, and mm, it, 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 and now this agreement is coming up for renewal. So like when it comes to this arrangement, as I said, they could be provisional or open-ended. So for that specific arrangement, it's expiring in a few years from now. And now in June this year, right, actually the parties have to declare the intent, whether they want to extend or terminate this arrangement, right? And it's very interesting because if we think geopolitically, right, South Korea and Japan and in that Asia Pacific region, you would think these are allies, right? In the current geopolitics, you would think, right, they would stick together, and it probably would have some uh, kind of spillover effect, right, when it comes to economic cooperation, right? But what is interesting here, right, there are a couple of factors. So on the one hand, there is this hesitance, right, on Japan's side to go forward. And why? Because of the change in international maritime law, right? That now Japan, technically speaking, under new rules, could actually claim most of this area as its own exclusive economic zone. So South Korea is suspicious that Japan uses this economic viability issue as a kind of as a pretext, actually, but in fact it wants to terminate this agreement and then try to get this whole area for itself. And there are oil and gas resources in the area. So they assume that if there is something nearby in the proximity, so South Korea would, as their thinking would go, right, that it should be something in this area as well. But Japan is sort of sabotaging, right, this effort. And way it gets really interesting here as well, right? That China claims that much of this zone is within its jurisdiction, right? So obviously, we know that China lays lots of claims in that area, and um, and it's already developing, right? Some areas there. And what complicates matters, right, is that Japan already looked at cooperating with China and signed joint agreement with China in other areas, right, that near this joint development zone. So I think where this case is really interesting, right, is when you look at that, when you look at political composition, right, or if we look at this sort of triangle, right, we have South Korea, Japan, and China, and then we look at Japan, right, that joined some agreements with China and now is looking at this area. But the danger here, of course, right, if Japan wants to go on and try to claim this area for itself, right, China also actually stated that that this zone is under its jurisdiction. So it could be a risky move on the part of Japan, right? So like you would think that maybe these two countries, South Korea and Japan, should actually work together and move forward together, right, to strengthen their both geopolitical and economic union, and maybe it's better not to rock the boat. But it would be interesting to see what's going to happen, because I was looking at some news articles because I wanted to see what's happening. And so, sadly, the only information I found from a few months ago that they started negotiating or whatever they want to do, but there is still not much information about how this country is going to move forward, whether they want to renew it or it will be terminated, or some other arrangement may be agreed upon. So I know I have to stop because I've been speaking for too long. So I have two other cases, but maybe if some interesting cases. But maybe if there are some questions, I could use those cases to illustrate certain points, right? But it just like the goal here. I'm just going to show you something. The end goal, right? As I said, we have this threefold research question, right? So when and why created, effective or not, and success or failure factors. That's kind of at the end of the day, that's the table I hope to have completed, and just to make kind of some I don't know, some generalizations, right, from using all this rich information or that is available on different cases and different factors out there. So it's quite a big undertaking. So if you have any ideas or any suggestions, they would be welcome. Maybe just even for a potential kind of maybe a paper that could be uh, written just without even going into into completing all this kind of long uh, project, right? Because when I'm looking at that, I feel like it's a bit too ambitious, because now when I'm working on all these cases, I feel I'm a little bit overwhelmed and kind of drowning in all of that information. So I thought, you know what, I would present what I have now. I would present it to you, and hopefully your questions would help clarify my thoughts, my thinking about this project and all of that. And if you have any suggestions, they're most welcome. Like totally self-serving in a way, right? But I guess that's the point of the seminars, right? Of these talks, to present our research in progress and get some feedback, and not to be isolated, right? When working on all of this issues. So thank you so much. I do appreciate your attention, and apologies for taking up too much time.